Hi, I'm Parneet Jaggi, and in this second lecture on St. Joan by George Bernard Shaw, I'm going to be talking about the plot of the play in detail. Now, as we had mentioned in the earlier lecture, this is an important play for several reasons. St. Joan was staged for the first time in New York in the famous Garrick Theatre in 1923, and it attracted several kinds of responses, generally positive ones. Now, what is the importance and significance of this play in the historical scenario of English literature is that Shaw, as a writer, made use of numerous historical sources, including even the transcripts of Joan's trial, and St. Joan, being a historical figure who was canonized years after her death, was a kind of a revolution of her age. Now, this play specifically helped to cement G.B.Shaw's reputation to a large extent, so much so that in 1926 he received the Nobel Prize for Literature. So, this is one way in which this play still plays an important role in English literature. Now, when we have to look at the story of the play, of course, it is taken from the background, the historical background, which we had discussed earlier briefly. Now, we shall take up the summary or the synopsis of the play so that we have a clear picture and an idea of what happened in the play and also in the real life in England and France. Now, this play is set between 1429 and 31 with an epilogue set in 1456. This was the time when 100 Years' War was raging between England and France, and English forces had occupied a number of French cities and towns. So, when we begin with the play, scene 1 opens on a spring morning in the year 1429. And the first scene is set in the castle of Vaucouleurs in France, and this is the character, Captain Robert de Baudricourt, who was an important character in the play. He is expressing his anger, his annoyance to his steward, who is an employee, that the chickens are not laying eggs, and he is frustrated because the cows are also not producing milk. So he suggests that the steward might be stealing these foodstuffs. But the steward very honestly, innocently explains that the lack of milk and eggs can be attributed to a divine curse. And then he explains that until Robert agrees to meet with a maid who was standing out, this maid was actually Joan, who later became St. Joan. So he should agree to meet with the maid. The chickens and cows will not return to their normal behavior. And Joan had been waiting for 2 days to see Robert, but he had stubbornly refused to meet her. Now, in the meantime, we see that Joan is a young girl who has been spending time with the soldiers outside till she is granted permission to come inside the court by Robert Baudricourt. And she's praying because she has not been sent away by the steward, and she has some positive aura about it. She is full of courage, she is full of conviction, and she motivates the people around her. Now, looking at all this, Robert feels frustrated and suddenly calls from the window telling Joan to come up and meet him. And the steward in the meantime explains him that Joan has come to the castle seeking armor and a sword so that she can be attired like a soldier. Now Joan enters the room in this scene. She calmly tells Robert that she wants a horse, armor and some soldiers, and she's going to seek a meeting with the Dauphin. Now this Dauphin is the French heir to the throne. So Robert responds by telling her that her requests are outrageous. But she doesn't get angry. She explains that God will change his mind, just as God has led him to finally meet her. She also explains that the items that she's requesting are necessary because she's going to break the siege of Orleans. Now this is a French city which has been besieged by the English troops. Now on hearing this, Robert is shocked at Joan's plan, but she simply explains that she's already persuaded 3 of Robert's soldiers to go with her, and she is determined to do it. She is confident that if she gets proper help from Robert, he will go to heaven after his death. Now, obviously, Robert is not convinced and he orders her out of the room so that he can talk and confer privately with Bertrand Poligny. Then there is a discussion going on, there is a complication, they don't understand what to do, and Poligny feels that unless a miracle takes place, Orleans is going to be lost to the English. So he offers to pay for Joan's horse himself and agrees to the plan. Now, Robert calls Joan back in and asks her about what it is like when she hears the voices of the saints, because she is a blessed being. She's a blessed girl who hears voices, sounds, and she has an aura that she carries along with her, and she dissipates that positivity all around. Now, Joan doesn't give an explanation or a detailed account, but she insists that the messages she receives are genuinely God's plans. So this is how we are introduced to this girl, Joan, who kind of partially puts it in words what she goes through, but she has a conviction to carry that she can save the French throne from the English. Now these people, Robert and Polly, they're still suspicious about this girl. But then they think that she might be able to inspire the soldier and, more importantly, the Dauphin. So Robert agrees to give Joan the things that she's asking for, and he tells her to go with Polly and other soldiers to see the Dauphin. Now, when Robert is alone, the steward returns again with a basket of eggs, and what they observe is that fortunately the hens have started laying eggs again. Robert wonders if everything Joan has said about herself could actually be true. So proceeding to scene 2. Now scene 2 is set on March 8th, 1429 in the French city of Chinon. The Archbishop of Reims and the Lord Chamberlain, Monseigneur de la Trémol, are talking, and the latter is complaining that the Dauphin owes him money. Now this Archbishop notes that he is also owed money and speaks of the Dauphin in a disrespectful way. So in this scene we are introduced to the politics that goes on in that kingdom and about the throne, in which they behave with each other and they treat each other in a disrespectful way, and the way this politics comes to highlight in the play. Now there is the entrance of another nobleman, Monsieur de Rice, nicknamed Bluebird. Now this Bluebird is also entering the scene, and Tremoille sarcastically comments on La Hire. So there is a kind of a sarcastic exchange of words, warnings and disrespectful remarks. So basically this scene is an introduction of these people who dominate the court and stay around the Dauphin. Now when Joan approaches the Archbishop and falls to her knees, asking him to bless her, he is moved by her piety. Now this Archbishop is an important character so far as he represents the church in this play. And when Joan asks to be alone with Charles, he agrees, telling everyone that Joan has been sent by God. So when she is alone with Charles, Joan asks him why he lets everyone push him around and tell him what to do. Now she has judged the entire political scenario around Charles, and she is concerned about the French throne. So Charles explains that he has no desire for power or authority. He would just like to be left alone to live a quiet life, and he would prefer to end the war by diplomacy rather than war. So the tension mounts between these two characters as Joan mentions Charles' young son, and Charles replies bitterly that he doesn't even trust his son. Now, Joan finally persuades Charles that he needs to fulfill God's will by displaying leadership. And Charles summons all the other lords back and then tells them that, look, this girl Joan is now in charge of the army. Now, although there are complaints against it, but Charles is now decided. Now, when we move to the next scenes are 3 and 4. These scenes open on April 29, 1429. Now, these are the historical accounts from which this story has been taken. And this scene is happening just outside the city of Orleans. Now, Dunois is also nicknamed as the Bastard. He's the bastard son and is the leader of the French forces, and he paces back and forth on the bank of the river Loire, accompanied by his page, his servant. Now, Dunois is frustrated because the wind is blowing east and he needs a west wind to sail upriver of the English forces and get into the planned strategic position. Now, at this moment, Joan arrives dressed in an armor. She's angry because she's been taken to the riverbank opposite to Orleans. Dunois explains why. The bridge that would allow them to cross the river and mount an attack is closely guarded by English soldiers. Now, Dunois is impressed with Joan, although he's also curious about her status as a woman engaging in warfare. So he kind of brusquely tries to explain that Joan tries to explain that she's not like other women and she's not interested in those feminine things, the same things as these other women are. So she turns her conversation to the military strategy and planning an aggressive assault on the English forces. So this kind of convinces Dunois a bit. Then suddenly Joan states that she will ask God, she will pray to God to send a west wind. And within moments, we see that the play shows that the wind starts to blow. Now, Dunois is awestruck. He's surprised and shocked and kneels before her, proclaiming her as the commander of French forces. The troops begin to move upriver, eager to mount an attack. Now, here in this scene again, we see a shift to the tent in the English camp. Now, there is an English nobleman here who is the Earl of Warwick. He's reading and he's accompanied by his assistant or a chaplain. Now, Warwick is discussing something about books with her. And with Joan leading the French, there have been massive defeats at Orleans and other places. So, Warwick here points out that amidst these military tensions, men are more and more likely to take on a national identity. Now, here we have an important point taking up in English literature, the national identity, whether as French or in English. So, this kind of a conversation goes on in this scene. Now, in the meanwhile, in their tent, in which the Earl of Warwick is discussing, Cochin arrives and he explains that Charles is about to be crowned as the king at Reims. So they give the news. Now, meanwhile, this scene kind of tells us about the British stance and their discussion about Joan, because they are surprised. Joan has now become a tool of the devil. And these people kind of discuss her as to whether she is a heretic or a witch or not a witch. So the kind of planning to remove her from the path of the victory of the British has now started. So now in the next scenes, scene 5 and 6, this scene 5 opens in Reims Cathedral where Joan is praying. Dunois enters and tells her that the crowd is calling for her, but she explains that she doesn't want to take away from the king's glory on the day of his coronation. So we see Charles is going to be coronated as the king of France. Joan and Dunois have become good friends, and Joan asks him why so many people at the court dislike her. Once they've taken Paris, she just wants to go back to the country. Now, country is the countryside, her village from where she comes. She's becoming more disillusioned, and her voices are the only thing she can rely on. So we here find Joan as a more powerful character than the earlier scenes. Now, here Dunois also cautions her that she might not be allowed to lead an attack on Paris, and that he's uncomfortable when she talks about her voices. So she has kind of become an enigma, an unpredictable character for all around her. Now, Charles enters the scene and he complains that he has found the experience of the coronation very unpleasant. But Joan says that now that Charles is crowned, she is going to return to her home, but she is disappointed when Charles seems relieved to hear this. So she asks both Dunois and La Hire to continue to fight to drive the English out entirely. But then Joan abruptly announces that she wants to take Paris before she goes home. So now here we see that she emerges as a powerful character who is convinced to win the entire France, even Paris, which is a very, very difficult task. Now Charles doesn't like this idea because he's tired of fighting. He's now the king and he wants to relax. But when the Archbishop joins the group, Charles explains Joan's proposition about Paris to him. And Joan defiantly insists that she knows what is best because, again, the voices that God tells her. So she kind of becomes stubborn at her decision, and the argument about attacking Paris becomes more heated. So she has La Hire by her side, but all the other people disagree. Because attacking Paris would mean being seriously outnumbered. They do not have that number of soldiers to fight for Paris. Now, surprisingly, there is a twist here. We have the representative of the church, the Archbishop, who here takes the opportunity of saying that even the church would not come to her aid in this act of winning or fighting for Paris. In fact, it would likely burn her for witchcraft. Now, he would not advocate for her because he thinks she is guilty of pride. Now Joan realizes that she will be abandoned if she is captured by the English. Now she knows nobody is going to stand by her side if during the war, during the fight, if she is taken a prisoner by English, nobody is going to come for her help. No, not even the French dynasty or the kingdom or the soldiers. But see the power of the character. She still remains defiant. She explains that she'll put all of her trust in God and she exits. Now they're all surprised. They don't know how she's going to do about it. Now, we very soon in this scene, we also see the action resumes in May 1431, and we see that a church trial is taking place. And this church trial scene is also an important scene in the whole of English literature. And this Cochin says that he is determined that Joan will have a fair trial. And he's rebuking the others, Warwick, for threatening anybody who sides with Joan. So they all are against Joan. Nobody stands by her side. So they have not tortured her, even though this was a standard practice in those times. But Joan is going to be convicted. So Warwick makes it quite clear that he needs Joan dead. Now, because the Englishmen are dead enemies of the French army and Joan leads the army, so obviously they're going to be aiming at her death. And so he even declares that if church won't convict her, he will act independently accordingly. So now this has been decided that Joan's death is the priority for the Englishmen. Then we see in the scene, Joan enters. And we are not really shown the entire battle scene or the fight scene, but we are just shown the discussions the French and the English are doing. So, in the next scene where we see that something has happened, and Joan enters and she complains that she's being held by the English, and she is not happy. She is resentful of the care they take to prevent her escape. So there are people who are trying to counsel her. She refuses to be sworn in, and Kaursali suggests she be tortured to ensure that she speaks the truth during the trial. But Joan is stubborn. She refuses to swear loyalty to the church over her voices, and she even refuses to stop wearing the men's clothes. So they say that if Joan she doesn't repent, she will be burnt at the stake. Now this threat frightens her a little, because she claims that her voices have promised her that she will not be burnt. So she expresses a willingness to recant or to confess. So this is again a twist in the story. Joan signs a kind of a confession which expresses penitence for dressing like a man and pretending to hear voices and disobeying the authority of the church. So she signs this. And then they explain it to her that she has to spend the rest of her life in prison. She is horrified. She is horrified because she assumed that if she signs a recantation or a confession, she would be set free. But life in prison is no life at all. So she tears that signed document. Now it is confirmed by these people, these Englishmen, that she is a heretic. So it is declared that Joan should be taken to the fire immediately. So everyone rushes off to see the execution, leaving Cochin and Lemaitre behind. So people are surprised, people are shocked, but it happens. So we see a short time later, there is agitation, there is horrifying, but there is execution also. An English soldier is made to make a small cross out of sticks for Joan. And then there is a cross for Joan to look at. He feels that Joan died an innocent. So we see that she is executed. So the executioner enters and tells Warwick that Joan's ashes and her heart have been dumped into the river so that people will not memorialize her. People will not remember her. But Warwick suggests that Joan's memory will still live on. So this is how we see it is a pathetic description of how this innocent but brave and adamant young girl dies fighting for her own country. Now when we look at the epilogue, we see that the epilogue opens on a June night in 1456. Now King Charles is in bed reading, and we see Ladvenu abruptly enters the room, and he announces that Joan's name has finally been cleared. The hearing was disorderly, full of lies and corruption, but it resulted in the truth being relieved. Charles expresses his relief, restoring Joan's reputation, also legitimizes his own. Now this epilogue basically tells us that Joan was absolved. She was freed of the charges of heresy and guilt years later. So Charles also cynically points out that if Joan were to come back to life, people would just burn her again. So Ledvenu leaves the room in anger. So we see in the epilogue, what we find is that there is an after contemplation. Now there is a sudden appearance of a vision of Joan's. When Charles is contemplating, we see a vision of Joan's appears. And Charles is kind of surprised and startled, and he proudly reports to her that he has become very good and he is good at fighting now and all that stuff, and she points out that she was burnt. And he knows it, but he does not react so much. So she is trying to come alive and remind him that what all happened to her was not fair. So we see that there is a kind of a passive conversation between the two. And then a gentleman enters who's wearing clothes from the 1920s during the time of Joan. So there is a kind of a vision going on, a visual play going on in the eyes of Charles. Now, Jones is coming back to life. This is kind of a scene being enacted. All the other people vanish, leaving Joan alone with a common soldier. And he reassures her not to listen to powerful people and to be true to herself. Then a bell chimes, summoning him back to hell. So Joan is left alone. She wonders aloud when earth will be ready to receive God's saint. So this is a kind of a vision that Charles has in 1456. Now, what is the need of a epilogue? Now 1431 to 1456, we have a gap of these years, which shows that in this time Charles had set up his empire and had become a king, and but still this memory, this vision of Joan kept coming to him. And in this memory, in this vision also, Jones was telling him that she wonders when earth will be ready to receive saints like her. So this was a long, detailed historical and the plot overview of the play Saint Joan by George Bernard Shaw. We'll be taking up another discussion on this play in the next lecture. Thank you for now.